Are you a true Vagrant Story fan? Have you drank the commemorative Vagrant Story wine then? Do you still have some? Can I buy it from you?
Steve, what kind of wine is that you're drinking? I can't see, hon.
Sweet berry wine! I'm supposed to spit it out. But no way, Jose!
Vagrant Story is a game that has always intimidated me. As a young child, Final Fantasy VII initiated me into JRPGs. Then one fateful day at Blockbuster, Final Fantasy Tactics called out to me, and I stepped into the world of Ivalice. The dark fantasy setting and complex battle system felt like the next logical step to my still-forming brain. I was totally sucked in. We rented Final Fantasy Tactics as much as we could from Blockbuster, and then one birthday, I received my own copy, allowing me to finally finish it. Years would go by. My brother then, one day, depressed the disc of a game called Vagrant Story into our aged PS1. This is the same copy I own and played for this video. I would watch him play in a hot CRT during the summer days on our futon, bewildered. He would spend hours in the workshop, crafting weapons and combining armor. The world seemed an endless maze, and the combat targeting different limbs and the box puzzles showed little in similarity to my beloved Final Fantasy Tactics. But without being told, I could tell from the aesthetics and music that it was Final Fantasy Tactics, spiritually at least. Many years later, my brother gave me his copy of Vagrant Story. This was about 8 years ago. I played through the game having no idea why I was doing so little damage to most enemies. Its dense systems for edged versus blunt versus piercing, combined with different elemental affinities and enemy type modifiers, had me feeling like the same 8-year-old barely formed brain boy watching his brother from his Florida room futon again. But the world of Vagrant Story was so captivating that I brute forced my way through. My first playthrough took me around 50 hours. This playthrough, after researching how the systems actually worked, it took me around 25 hours. Don't pay attention too much to my runtime because it's inflated from when I paused the game because I couldn't figure out a box puzzle and had to make my showtime of Poor Things on Christmas Eve. Of course, I wanted to play Vagrant Story again because of its significance in Matsuno's career, being the last feature-length game he directed. But more than that, I wanted to experience the story I had forgotten and unlock my dormant memory. Then I could research and learn if the rumors I had heard about the game were true. Before researching, I had 3 questions. Was it true that the game was padded out to reach a longer runtime due to interference from Squaresoft? How connected is Vagrant Story to Final Fantasy Tactics and Ivalice in general? And what was cut from the game due to deadlines and memory limitations? After researching, I had one new question. Where can I get some Vagrant Story wine? Dev history. Vagrant Story was released in Japan February 10th, 2000, and May 16th in the States. For this video, we're going to do something a little different. I will go over the key staff members that migrated from the Final Fantasy Tactics team to Vagrant Story here, but most of the development history will be in the spoilers section. I can't say why without spoiling stuff, so you have been warned. The key development staff of Vagrant Story include Yasumi Matsuno at the helm as director, writer, and producer, and Final Fantasy Tactics veterans Hiroshi Minagawa on art direction, Akihiko Yoshida on character design, Taku Murata, the main programmer, and Hitachi Sakamoto on the score. Because I am a Squaresoft simp, I spent a few hours of research time trying to find any weird Vagrant Story ephemera. I'll go into a few more examples in the spoilers section, but I found a reasonably priced Vagrant Story comic book that was released at 2000's E3. This small comic book called the Preview Edition E3 2000 Exclusive Monster Edition has an interesting Western take on Vagrant Story, with Ashley fighting various, monsters. But what caught my eye when flipping through was an interview with Matsuno. If you want to read the full interview, I'll link a forum post that transcribed it, and I'll upload photos of the interview on my Twitter/X. In this interview, we get an idea of the size of the team and how long development took. I'll read the interview verbatim. Interviewer: how long did it take you to create this game? How many people worked on it? Yasumi Matsuno: Excluding the movie department, responsible for the beginning CG movie, the number of the staff that actually worked on game development is about 50. We started in January of '98 with an initial number of 20 people. We steadily increased members and had a maximum number of 50 at our peak. At the time of Master Up in January 2000, we had approximately 30 people. One other interesting thing to note, according to Alexander O. Smith in an interview done with the Vagrant Story podcast in 2021, the production of Vagrant Story was put on hold at some point in development.
I was wondering what I was going to do about that particular situation when Vagrant Story actually got shelved briefly. And because they said no, they had to figure something else out. So we won't actually start localization of that for a while.
In the Vagrant Story Ultimania, Matsuno is quoted as having Metal Gear shock. And since the game is so heavily influenced by Metal Gear Solid's in-game cinematics, this could be an explanation. Did the team start on a more traditional tactical RPG initially, and then shift gears when they saw what Kojima at Konami was cooking up with the new Metal Gear? This interview had one other crazy bit of info, but play the game and meet me in the spoilers section for that one. One last thing before we move to the gameplay of Vagrant Story. The last few years in this series, the Tactical RPG Odyssey, I've been charting the games and legacy of Yasumi Matsuno. I knew this would take a very long time, but since he's responsible for my favorite games and what I consider the pinnacle of the genre, I wanted to figure out what makes him tick and why his projects resonate with me more than any others. And his statement on the From the Development column on the Vagrant Story website, I think, gives some insight. Matsuno, why did we decide to rise to the challenge of creating such a game? Both inside and outside of our company, people have asked us time and again why we didn't make a simulation role-playing game. This is undoubtedly a game that both looks different and offers a feel of play that is truly different from anything we have ever made. However, it is still a game born from the techniques and know-how we gained from our earlier works. Using these as a base, we added a healthy amount of groping in the dark and produced this new style of play. This is not a simulation role-playing game like my team's previous games, Final Fantasy Tactics. Vagrant Story is a step in the evolution of role-playing games, a new simulation role-playing game. Matsuno goes on to say, in the midst of sequels where popular characters are recycled to get even better reviews, we dared to create a new title for our game. And after reading that, I sat down and thought about Matsuno's career. He really has never repeated himself. From Ogre Battle to Tactics Ogre, from Tactics Ogre to Final Fantasy Tactics, and from Final Fantasy Tactics to Vagrant Story. He's never directed a direct sequel in his entire career. Ogre Battle 64 and Tactics Ogre The Night of Lotus were created at Quest without his involvement. He had a producer role on Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, but even if he was the director, I wouldn't call Advance a direct sequel. I'm still not sure what makes Matsuno so special. Is it related to his insistence on not repeating himself? There are two major reasons I've found to explain the magical quality Matsuno games have. One is Matsuno's ability to recognize talent. From his days at Quest, he's had a very consistent team of key development staff that create a cohesive feel to his game worlds, with Yoshida, Sakamoto, and Minagawa. As he puts it himself, the staff that works under me are the creative ones. My job is to unite their different personalities and creativities into one coherent whole. That might be the more important quality, but the other gift Matsuno possesses is being a dedicated and damn good writer. Alexander O. Smith, who localized Vagrant Story in tremendous fashion, said in the same interview cited before that Matsuno's games are, if not the best written games he's worked on, at least equal to the best. Even Hironobu Sakaguchi, father of Final Fantasy, was taken aback by Matsuno's level of commitment to his characters. In an interview in Famitsu, translated by Shmuplation, Sakaguchi talks about Matsuno's time crafting the world of Final Fantasy Tactics. Sakaguchi. One time I took a look at the whiteboard that Matsuno would sometimes have by his desk, and I saw this huge chart that detailed all the character relationships. He's quite the obsessive when it comes to his work. I remember seeing one of the connections between the characters, and it said they have a hard time understanding each other. I thought to myself, man, this is going to be a deep game. Gameplay. Understanding the systems of Vagrant Story makes for a much better time. There's something to being said for hitting your head against a Matsuno game until you finally get it. Before there was Dark Souls, breaking players until they got good, there was Final Fantasy Tactics Slums of Dordor, or Vagrant Story's Phantoms. The gameplay in Vagrant Story can be split into 3 parts: combat, box puzzles, and map navigation. The ratio is about 98% combat/menu navigation to 1% of the latters. Coming from Final Fantasy Tactics, it's easy to feel like you're losing depth having only one playable character. But the ingeniousness of Matsuno and team is clear in their ability to pack all the systems you're used to from their games, plus maybe a few more than you wanted, by making your limbs and equipment function as their own party members.
What do you mean by that?
Well, at first the game presents you with a unique but simple combat scenario. As Ashley Riot, the protagonist, oh yeah, this game has a protagonist, you square soft, off against 2 humans. Similar looking to Parasite Eve, you have a targeting sphere that acts like a prototype of the Fallout 3 VAT system. You can target their body parts, but the game gives you no indication why you would want to target one limb over the other, aside from percentage chance to hit and damage. But if you're like me and read the physical manual, also check out the in-game manual, it's pretty good, you would know that doing enough damage to a certain body part results in certain effects. The most useful throughout the game is bonking the magic users on the head because it silences them after a set amount of damage. I won't do a counter for the amount of Matsuno systems in this game, but feel free to tally at home yourself. Taking a closer look under the damage accuracy percentage line, you'll see target, single, edged, physical, human. Breaking this down, this means your attack is targeting a single target. You will get AoE spells later in the game that target multiple. EGD, or edged, means your weapon is edged, which becomes very important a few hours in when you're trying to figure out why you're doing no damage.
Perfect.
PHY means physical, because attacks can be physical or many different elemental affinities. And human means you're attacking a human. Your damage is determined by so many factors in Vagrant Story. To make it simple as possible, ignoring magic and break arts for now, you can have a weapon that is either edged, blunt, or piercing. Each enemy will have different defenses depending on what type of weapon. Weak to piercing, strong against edge, etc. And if that was the only consideration, then all you would have to do is keep one of each weapon type with you and bang, Vagrant Story defeated.
Excellent!
But wait, there's more. That physical indicator isn't just because you're not using magic, it's because your weapon is considered physical affinity. As you do damage to different enemies or slot in gemstones that change the affinity, the type of damage your weapon does changes. There's an option to turn on an indicator that shows you how it changes as you attack, but I didn't realize that until I'd already beat the game. If you go into the menu and check the status of the weapon, you can see this as well, just not as it's happening. So certain enemies like a water elemental, for instance, are weak against fire damage. So if you have a fire mace that does blunt damage and that water elemental is weak against fire and blunt, you'll do a lot of damage. But you can see how the complexity is growing, right? What if it's weak against fire but strong against blunt? And why does the UI highlight that the enemy is human and not dancer? So along with weapon type and elemental affinity, you also have to consider the enemy type. Human, evil, beast, undead, phantom. The more you use a weapon on one type of enemy, the stronger it becomes against said enemy type. Makes sense? Okay. Keep in mind that using it against one enemy type makes it weaker against almost every other enemy type at the same time. Did we talk about PP yet? And by PP, I mean phantom points, of course. Also, weapon degradation is a thing too. That combined with elemental buffs, strength buffs, debuffs on most enemies, and I think that's the majority of the combat stuff. Like Matsuno games, it's packed with systems to the point where, as long as you get your head around 75% of them, you'll be okay. I didn't have a strong grasp on phantom points until after the game, and made it out okay. There are many different philosophies on the best way to play the game, and I would encourage you to experiment and learn for yourself on your first playthrough. But if you need some pointers, I'll go over my method during this playthrough, and also put a link in the description to Resident Ark's great video that will help you get started. This playthrough, I thought I had it all figured out. I thought if I just had one weapon for each enemy type and switched every time I fought a human versus a beast, I would crush the game like never before. And it worked for a little while. You get spells as the game progresses that buff you and debuff your opponent, so applying those liberally, and especially with bosses, had me feeling cocky for a while. But Phantoms kept suggesting that I was playing the game incorrectly. I had a weapon that I only used for Phantoms, but I still did little damage. Even buffing myself and lowering their stats, it was tedious doing 1 to 4 points of damage as they warped away and laughed at me. This is where elemental affinity and weapon type show their importance. You'll unlock spells eventually that infuse air, fire, water, etc. affinity into your weapon. Also gems that boost those affinities too. There's an analyze spell I never use that will show you what the enemy is weak against, I suppose, but the only enemies that I needed to use elemental spells on had pretty obvious tells. If you use my method and have a different weapon for each enemy type and maybe keep an extra all-purpose weapon for the 3 weapon types, the game isn't that difficult, unless you're really bad at box puzzles. Before that, let's talk about the workshop. As mentioned before, I had vivid memories of watching my brother toil away improving his weapons in the workshops. And the reason I have such vivid memories of this is probably because of the sheer amount of time my brother had to spend in those workshops. This game in some ways is a technical marvel. There are interviews about the clever ways the designers hid load times during the event scenes and the amount of time they spent rotating their camera around each model, making sure the polygons didn't clip or leave gaps. But this is still a PS1 game, trying to tease more out of that poor PS1 than it can really handle. And the one thing about Vagrant's story that makes it hard to recommend for the faint of heart is the amount of menu navigation. And the workshop is where all of those load times get together and have a party. You can only craft new weapons and armor in these workshops. And not only that, you are limited to certain types of materials, say iron and leather, in each workshop when it comes to combining and creating new items. You can still assemble weapons of varying types, but Ashley Riot, well, able to hold an unbelievable amount of shit, he is a risk breaker, has to offload some of his stuff in the magically connected chests that populate each workshop. And every time you access one of these, the game has to access your save. This is not a fast process. And if you hit the wrong button, and you will, this process repeats itself. This is how you assemble the most powerful weapons and armor in the game. But the game makes it so unfriendly and time-consuming that I only did it the bare minimum. The only enemy I really had trouble with using my playstyle was the last boss. A remake that removes the load times and tidies up the crafting system would make this game perfect in my opinion. I think the bones of the crafting system are strong, but in practice, not so fun. That and adding a quick swap function for weapons. By holding down the L2 button, you can quickly navigate to items, magic, break art, and chain and defensive abilities. Why they couldn't have done the same thing with weapons, I don't know. Memory limitations? It's weird that the game punishes you for using the same weapon on different enemy types, but then makes it a chore to swap weapons. Load times with the workshop and quick swapping weapons. If they can remedy these two issues in a remaster, then this game would have no problems. Oh wait, the chain system. Let's just say, as you get used to the system, you'll be calling yourself 2 Chains quite often. After defeating an early boss in the game, Ashley regains the ability to chain attacks. By timing your button presses of square, triangle, and circle when the game prompts you with an exclamation point, you can do additional attacks with various effects. Some chain attacks inflict status ailments, while others can heal your MP in order for you to do more magic buffs. The more you use this ability, the more risk you accrue. The more risk, the less chance you have of hitting the enemy, and the more damage you take. The system is beautiful in the way it rewards a strategic approach. You are quite literally assessing your risk every move you make against a boss. You ask yourself, do I go in for another hit and hope I fell this dragon, knowing that if I don't hit the timing and the dragon gets a counterattack, I'll take all the more damage?
How could this happen to me? I made my mistakes, got no...
How you use your chain abilities and similarly defense abilities that work the same way timing-wise will determine how fun Vagrant's story is for you. As you perform successful chains, you unlock new abilities, and changing your loadout mid-battle to focus on damage dealing versus status infliction really gives Vagrant's story a feel unlike any other game I've ever played. Sure, there's a few too many systems, but I kind of like that in Matsuno's games. It makes me feel a sense of realism. Like, no matter how much you consider an encounter in combat, there are always going to be unknowns, and your brain can't prepare for all of them. story. On to the story part of Vagrant's story. Its scale and cast pale in comparison to Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre, and this is on purpose. Matsuno explains that Vagrant's story is meant to be more like a suspense film than the sprawling epics of his past two games. But did form come after function? Matsuno insists that he's a business-minded individual, that he decides what kind of project he will pursue based on what the market desires but might not know it needs yet, and that after seeing Metal Gear Solid, that a more cinematic title was the best direction. I'm not sure an uber-opaque battle system was what the general populace was really fiending for back in 2000, but again, it did reach greatest hit status, right? I haven't been able to find definite sales data for Vagrant's story. The closest thing I found is a few articles citing that it did sell 100,000 copies in its first 20 days. The memory limitations of the PlayStation combined with the desire to have Vagrant's story be fully 3D required a smaller scale. The game is focused for the most part on the location of Le Monde and a small cast of characters. And yet even with or maybe because of the tighter focus, Matsuno tells a video game story that still stands strong. Because of time, 8 years since last playing it, or perhaps suppressed memories, I had forgotten all of the plot of Vagrant's story. Going into it fresh, I was captivated. You are Ashley Riot, a risk breaker, read Special Agent of this universe.
I am the FBI.
Depending on if you watch the cutscenes that play at the menu before starting the game, the story either starts at VKP, Valentia Knights of Peace headquarters, with a shady, candlelit meeting, or right in the action at Duke Bardorba's manor as it's being attacked. Either way, you learn that a cult, Molenkamp, led by Sidney Lostero, has kidnapped the Duke's son. Ashley catches up with Sidney and blasts him with a bowgun bolt, but that isn't enough. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. Ashley Riot, risk breaker. Sidney gets up, lunges at Ashley, and then summons a dragon. Sidney escapes but mentions Le Monde, a city abandoned after an earthquake 20 years ago, and Ashley gives chase. Ashley Riot and Sidney Lostero and their heart hunter relationship, along with the mystery of Le Monde, propel the story until the nature of Ashley's memories come to the fore. JRPGs play around with amnesia plenty, but Vagrant Story's unreliable narrator is different in the way Matsuno gives you only enough puzzle pieces to intuit your own series of events without laying out a definitive answer. The story part of Vagrant Story is so good that I don't want to spoil any more than the very beginning. Its themes are timeless, its presentation, direction, and writing still better than almost anything that has come before or after. We'll dive into spoilers later in the video, so when you finish the game and want to hear some crazy Duke Bardorba fan theories, follow me. Music. Hitoshi Sakamoto, as usual, kills it on the soundtrack. My appreciation for the music has only increased as I've come to understand the effectiveness of an atmospheric score. Instead of the catchy melodies of Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story uses the music to establish the feeling of Le Monde. The sound design needs to be credited for this as well. Tomohiro Yojima, who was in charge of the sound effects, used only synthesized sounds instead of sampling, in order to minimize overhead on memory, according to his interview in the Vagrant Story Ultimania. Thanks, Shmuplations. Every hit of the katana can be felt through the sound. And the menu effects are almost too strong for my tender ears. The soundtrack isn't one I listen to too often, aside from a few tracks, but in terms of what it achieves in ambiance, it needs to be applauded. Graphics. Graphically, Vagrant Story is one of my favorite looking games of all time. It's such a departure from what Matsuno's team normally worked on, and yet they nailed it on the first try. Many members of the team say in multiple interviews that the skill set they learned from working with harsh limitations on pixel art during the Super Famicom era carried over to 3D development with its own unforgiving polygon caps. Minagawa puts it best. Both the character modeling and animation were a big challenge because of the low polygon count. In Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, the texturing was different, but there we had about 700 polygons to work with for a single character. In Vagrant Story, because the backgrounds also use polygons, We only had about 320 to 330 for each character. In other words, about half of what we had for the Final Fantasy games. Figuring out how to model polygons within those limitations was very much like a puzzle. And model polygons well, they did. The designs of all the characters are memorable, but none more than the major characters, Ashley and the antagonist, Sydney. Dungeon crawling games are some of the worst offenders when it comes to repetitive environments, and thankfully each zone in Vagrant Story feels distinct, despite them all taking place in Le Monde, except for the opening. And it would be criminal for me to overlook the monster designs. Little flourishes like spears sticking out of the first boss, Detox Hide, or the first time you face the Minotaur, its gigantic hooves causing the ground to shake, are etched into my memory. They say the best games come out at the end of a console's life cycle, because by that point the developers have figured out all the quirks and hidden potential. Matsuno's team did that and more, with a level of craftsmanship still rarely seen to this day. Spoilers! Spoiler development history. Normally for a game like this I would talk about the development history at the outset, but because I think the way the game was made influenced the story, I didn't want to inadvertently spoil anything by making the connections that I'm about to make here in the main section of the video, for people who haven't experienced the game. I have no way of knowing how much of the story was vague on purpose, but I would like to present you with my findings after tracking down every scrap of information on Vagrant Story that I could. So first off, and most importantly, did you know that they cut some butt? There was originally going to be more butt cleavage in the CGI opening cutscene, but some cowards decided Mullenkamp was too hot for TV. Let me remind you of two of the three questions I posed near the beginning of the video. What was cut and what was added as padding? Matsuno is cited in the interview from The Ultimania, translated by Shmuplations, that he didn't want to have a narrative where the conclusions were drawn. He didn't want to draw them for the player. He wanted to leave it open for interpretation. The next piece of evidence I present is an interview conducted with Matsuno shortly after the Japanese release, posted on the Vagrant Story website around May 11th, 2000. Near the end of the interviewer, after stating that the game is 20 to 40 hours, asks, "So, the playtime is pretty long?" Matsuno responds, "Yes. In the summer of last year, I told a magazine in an interview that playtime was about 6 to 4 hours, but afterwards I received numerous comments from both inside and outside the company stating that it was too short." Parentheses, wry smile. In the end, volume was increased and gimmicks were added. It should be about 20 to 40 hours. By the way, I've heard that the fastest clear time from someone in our company was under 3 hours. Interviewer, that's a considerable gap. Laugh. Matsuno, since the game is an adventure game, I thought it was just about right. I was surprised of the numerous comments from players in Europe and the US saying that it was too short. The interview ends here, but the website says the interview will continue, but according to the archived versions of the website, it never was. And that interview Matsuno references from the summer of last year, must have been 1999, I have been unable to track down. If anyone is familiar with this or lives in Japan and wants to help me out, let me know. I looked through as many scans of Famitsu as I could find, holding up my Google Translate app on my phone, but didn't find any new information. So, in Matsuno's own words, quote, "Volume was increased and gimmicks were added." We can't know for sure what parts of Vagrant Story were added to increase the length. Box puzzles, maybe? Duplicated rooms, maybe? But we do have an idea of what things were cut in order to hit release date, and or because they were technologically impractical on the PS1. That brings us back to that E3 comic interview I cited earlier in the video for quite the whopper. Interviewer, did it change drastically from pre-production to end result? Yasumi Matsuno, it changed greatly. Due to capacity and development time, over half the scenario had to be cut. With this, it was also necessary to cut out gaming elements as well. There were AI-controlled NPCs that supported Ashley in the middle of the story, but they had to be cut as well due to memory restrictions. There were also more polygons per map that gave elaborate representations, but in order to increase processing speed, it was necessary to reduce the number of polygons. but in the end, we are proud that we were able to implement the best features on the PS hardware. And in the Ultimania interview, thank you Schmuplations, the interviewer asks, were there any mechanics or parts of the game that you had to entirely cut because of the memory limitations? Murata. There definitely were. For the battles, initially we had planned to use a more complex system of calculations. We had also planned to have slightly more effects for the spells and skills. Interviewer. It blows my mind that you produced something this accomplished with your first 3D game. Akiyama. Akiyama being one of the planners of Vagrant Story. Well, for me personally though, there's still a lot of things I'm unsatisfied with. There were also many elements we had to cut due to a lack of time or memory, such as a flashback dialogue between Sydney and the Duke of Bardorba, and scenes explaining Rosencrantz' motives. It's really a shame I couldn't include them. It is interesting to think of the alternate timeline Vagrant Story we could have gotten, a much shorter game. Matsuno's initial idea for Vagrant Story started with 2 hours of in-game cinematics, and then he built the game around that. If Matsuno's 4 to 6 hour timeline is to be believed, then my next question is, does that 4 to 6 hours include the 2 hours of cutscenes? If it does, then the actual gameplay would have been anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. If it doesn't, then the game at most still would have been only 6 to 8 hours long. We get a glimpse in the boss fight where Sydney assists Ashley what the rest of the game might have felt like with the AI companions. A more detailed world is something we can only imagine, but maybe if miracles are possible, Square Enix held on to the assets from Vagrant Story, and if they ever get around to a remaster, they could add in the higher polygon assets. The part that interests me the most is the idea that half the scenario had to be cut. Does this account for the fragmentary nature of the story? If again Matsuno is to be believed, the core theme is about memories and how events can be misrepresented or misremembered. Is he revising his own memory then on the theme of Vagrant Story due to the cuts that had to be made? Did the theme become what it was only after he realized the true version of Vagrant Story was impossible?
I like to remember things my own way.
What do you mean by that?
How I remembered them, not necessarily the way they happened.
Just like trying to figure out how true our own memories are, we will probably never know what Vagrant Story could have been. But that shouldn't take away from the one truth we do have, and that is the version of Vagrant Story that does exist. That is the beauty of sealing a game on a disc. Our memories of Vagrant Story may change, but the information on the disc will never change. It is immutable. Well, until disc rot sets in. Back to my assertion that Vagrant Story is Matsuno's Mulholland Drive. For those not familiar with David Lynch's masterpiece, Mulholland Drive, I would recommend turning this video off and watching that immediately. You're still with me? That's good. Most people who have dug into the Mulholland Drive rabbit hole know that it was intended to be a pilot for a television show, and then once scrapped, David Lynch found a way to reconfigure it into a movie by adding scenes to it. I was about to say adding scenes to make it make sense, but that's not really what Mulholland Drive and most of Lynch's movies are about. Just like Matsuno's intention not to draw conclusions for the player, Lynch gives you puzzle pieces and lets you fill in the rest. Vagrant Story's focus on suppressed memories and having the player and the main character struggle to reconcile parallel but mutually exclusive series of events is what had me thinking of Mulholland Drive after finishing my playthrough of Vagrant Story. Would Vagrant Story have been a better game if the missing half of its scenario hadn't been removed? And would a Vagrant Story been better without volume and gimmicks added? I won't draw the conclusions for you. I don't know the right way to view the situation either. I choose to accept what we have. Vagrant Story as it exists is still more interesting than most games. It has some obvious flaws. The amount of time in menus due to the workshop system and not having a quick swap function in the game for weapons that punishes you for not swapping weapons are hard flaws to overlook. But overlook them I did, because the story, art style, music, characters, writing, and other systems were so engaging that I returned for more punishment with the New Game Plus option. There's content you can only access after beating the game and starting from a New Game Plus clear save. I wouldn't recommend it for anyone looking for more story glimpses because there's nothing new story-wise. And then for the last question, how connected is Vagrant Story to Final Fantasy Tactics and Ivalice? The answer depends on who you ask and when. Cite pictures allegedly from journalists that interviewed Matsuno where he made a simple map showing their geographical approximation, aka the 3 things Matsuno thinks about the most. Thanks to a Resetera forum, I found a series of archived tweets between Matsuno and a fan where he lays out his version at the time of 2011. Ben Zach asked Yasumi Matsuno, and since Final Fantasy XII is set 1,000 years before Vagrant Story and has some Arabic setting, I wondered if it was intentional. And then Yasumi Matsuno says, I think the worldview of 2 works is not connected. At least I have never said that the 2 worldview is the same. Thanks. And then replying to a different tweet, Matsuno says, sorry, I overlooked your reply. VS, Vagrant Story, and FFT, Final Fantasy Tactics, is not the same place, but it's my thought and may be different from the publisher. Ben Zach again says at Yasumi Matsuno, maybe you changed your mind? Because there's one ITW interview from May 2004 where you explicitly say that events from 3 games continued. The interview in question has been archived, and it does have Yasumi Matsuno saying, Ivalice is a world that I have been designing since I arrived at Square in 1995. It is a very complex world with a heavy historical past. Also, the locations where Vagrant Story, FFT, and FF12 take place are quite close on the Ivalice map, but I can't tell you more about that at the moment. People in the forum came up with 2 reasonable answers to Matsuno's conflicting memory that I tend to agree with. Either Matsuno never intended the 2 to be connected, but was made by Squaresoft to include Easter eggs for the fans, aka mention of Agrias and the Zodiac Brave story by name, with one of the accessories in Vagrant Story, and near the beginning of the game they referenced Durai as, well, you know. Then, once put in charge of Final Fantasy XII, which I'm told has even more references to Vagrant Story, including Molenkamp, the cult and person that plays a large role in Vagrant Story, that Matsuno had no choice but to keep the connections going, because if Vagrant Story was connected to Final Fantasy Tactics, then of course if Final Fantasy XII was taking place in Ivalice, they must also be connected. After leaving Square Enix for reasons to be explored in a future episode, Matsuno decided as the creator of Ivalice, or at the very least his headcanon of Ivalice, that Vagrant Story is separate from Final Fantasy XII and or Tactics. Or, to sum it up more succinctly, a wild slime appeared in the chat. Slime. My interpretation of this whole thing has been that all the nods at VS always were just Easter eggs, but then when Final Fantasy XII was in development, Square Enix had grand plans to tie it more firmly, and at the time, he was fine with it. Then he lost control over Final Fantasy XII, and they started making Ivalice games without him. And now he just doesn't consider anything about the post-FFTA Ivalice games part of his Ivalice.
I like to remember things my own way.
What do you mean by that?
How I remembered them. Not necessarily the way they happened.
The other take is that something got lost in translation. Someone better versed in Japanese might be able to dispel this theory, but the question on Twitter could have been misinterpreted by either party. The games are linked without question if you don't take Matsuno's Twitter statements into account. So whether you believe Vagrant Story is connected to the other Ivalice games is really up to you. Those things do exist in the game, but are they real? Again and again, Vagrant Story's theme echoes its timeless question, what is the truth, and can we ever know it? The game leaves off with Ashley Riot inheriting the rude inverse / blood sin and donning a Kingdom Hearts-inspired Organization 13 getup way before it was cool, or even existed, and walking into the night. It's hard for me to imagine a follow-up for Vagrant Story. In the last few years, we did see Matsuno's take on A Vagrant Story 2 with an introduction he had written. They definitely leave the door open at the end of Vagrant Story, but it is one of those stories that feels perfectly self-contained, and that making a direct sequel would only compromise the original. That said, I think after a hopefully inevitable Final Fantasy Tactics sequel, that we'll see a remaster of Vagrant Story at the very least. The game's biggest flaws come from a console that could barely handle it. Spending half of your time in menus, it may have actually been more than that really, was a necessary evil of the time. But in 2024, there's no reason that I should have to commit 30 minutes to sorting my inventory in the workshop because I want to forge a Damascus weapon, but have run out of inventory slots. A remaster that fixes the load time issues would make this game twice as playable and enjoyable. I don't need a visual overhaul, the script is perfect, the cutscenes and art style timeless the way pixel art has come into appreciation. I think low poly in this vein has a beauty to it as well. The music, while I'd love an orchestrated version just because, is also one of my favorite Sakamoto scores. Underrated due to its less melodic nature, but fits the game perfectly. The Snowfly Forest theme can go die in a box with the Palace of the Dead theme from Tactics Ogre, but that's not really the song's fault. And Vagrant Story is also interesting because of what it represents in Yasumi Matsuno's career. This is the last uncompromised feature-length game Matsuno would direct. Final Fantasy XII, as far as I know, was incredibly compromised to the point where he was replaced as director, but we will examine that in a future video. And after that, he worked as a writer and assisted with Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. He is credited as the game designer for the smaller-scale Crimson Shroud, but not director. He seems to be back in Square Enix's good graces with contributions to Final Fantasy XIV and Tactics Ogre Reborn recently. The Nvidia leaks still hold promise of a Final Fantasy Tactics remake/remaster, so time will tell what his role will be on that, but writer-designer seems likely. I think Vagrant Story is a great game. It is worth playing even now. Just know what you're getting into, and give yourself some time to research its mechanics, and you'll thank me later. In conclusion, Vagrant Story is a great, if imperfect, game. It does so many things better than any game before or after it that it's easy, for me at least, to forgive its shortcomings. Remaster, remake, or sequel. As long as Matsuno's at the helm, I will delve the deeps of the dark anytime. Oh yeah, I almost forgot about that Vagrant Story wine. Along with a bunch of other random merchandise, Rude Inverse Zippo Lighter, Rude Inverse Beanie, Rude Inverse Money Clip, Rude Inverse Shirt, Rude Inverse Necklace, Vagrant Story Wallet. There was also a Vagrant Story wine. I don't know how much was made, but on the Japanese Vagrant Story website, they gave us a glimpse, and also Shinji Hashimoto, according to Siliconera, article posted a picture on Twitter showing an official bottle complete with wooden case. If anyone has a bottle and or Zippo and or other Vagrant Story merch, hit me up. I will drink this before I die, damn it. P.S. This didn't really fit anywhere else in the script, but I haven't heard anyone else mention this, so I thought I'd highlight it here. Something I always like to do is see what names mean, especially in video games, especially a game like this. I felt like the names were so unusual, no offense, but Ashley and Sydney, at least growing up where I'm from, are feminine names, but I know they probably aren't. Don't hurt me in the comments. But anyway, their names just kind of stood out as purposefully different. And so when I looked up the etymology of Ashley, I was so shocked that no one else has mentioned this, at least that I've seen. His name, at least according to a simple Google search, translates into Old English as dweller near the ash tree meadow. And since this is what an ash tree looks like, I mean, that one's pretty interesting. Right? That's a pretty interesting thing. I don't know what to make of it, or if there's some special significance to ash trees specifically, but hit me up in the comments if you've got any other theories. And then Sydney, on the meadow theme, his name just means wide meadow in Old English, again, if Google is to be believed. So I think there's something meaningful behind that. I've got my own theories, but hit me up with what you thought. And then Mullenkamp was just unusual enough I had to Google it, so it looks like that one just means, it says topographical name for someone who lived near a mill. So that one's not that interesting. We can think about it a little bit, like maybe a mill, you're creating something, but I didn't really get to a whole lot on that. And then the funniest one I found was Iocus, so the Church of Iocus or Icus or whatever. Apparently it's Greek or something for a joke. So they're the joke church, or the church of jokes. So that's also very funny to me. It might not be Greek or Latin. Okay, it's Latin. There you go. Close enough. And finally, for my wild theories about Duke Bardorba and Joshua. I'm still workshopping it, but since they mentioned the separation of body and soul a bunch, and that line where Sidney references what the Duke, his father, does for him when he was a child, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Duke passed on his immortality to Sidney, but that a side effect of this is a separation of the body and soul. My only real evidence is a few scant lines in the painting of the Duke's family, which only has one son. This could be explained away with the fact that who wants to paint another family portrait after you have a surprise baby, am I right? We've all been there. Or it could mean that Sidney is some weird immortal homunculus and that Joshua is somehow his living soul, or maybe even the Duke's soul. The Duke calls Joshua his soul in a way that I would love a native Japanese speaker to go over and see what that line translates to and parse out any extra meaning. Do you have your own Vagrant story theories too? Hit me up in the comments. On the next episode of the Tactical RPG Odyssey. And for our next chapter of the Matsuno saga, we look at another quest game made without Matsuno's involvement, but in his Ogre Battle series, Tactics Ogre, The Knight of Lotus.